Daytimes were packed with work, and I was doing all right, but nights were another story. The city felt lonelier than it should for a place so full. That's when I met Tom at a friend's party. He was loud, funny, and didn't care who knew it. His energy was infectious, and we hit it off from the moment he bumped into me, spilling my drink. "Hey, watch it," I snapped, more out of surprise than anger. "Well, my bad. Let me make it up to you. What were you drinking?" Tom grinned unapologetically. "Beer. Just beer," I said, trying not to smile too easily. "2 beers, coming right up," he shouted over the music, heading to the makeshift bar. That was Tom all over, simple, straightforward, and no fuss. We spent the whole night talking about everything and nothing. It turned out we both loved old movies and hated sushi. It was easy talking to him, and by the time the party was winding down, I didn't want to say goodbye. A year later, he proposed. No dramatic gestures, just him, me, and a ring he fumbled out of his pocket while we were watching TV. "Marry me?" he said, holding the ring so tightly I thought he might crush it. I laughed. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so typical of us, so perfectly imperfect. "Yes, of course, you big goof." Getting married didn't change much at first. We were the same, just legally bound, which felt right. We settled into life together in my small city apartment, still close to the hustle but now with someone to share the quiet moments. Life felt full, and for the first time in a long while, the evenings didn't feel so empty. Settling into married life had its comforts, but life sure doesn't let you get too cozy without throwing a curveball or two. Harry's folks, Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, were gems. Living in their cozy suburban home, they welcomed me with open arms from the get-go. I could see where Harry got his easygoing nature. Their warmth was a balm on my often sore heart, still aching from my own family losses. "So happy you're part of our family now," Mrs. Dawson would often say, squeezing my hand with a kindness that felt both uplifting and overwhelming. "Thanks, I really appreciate how welcoming you've been," I'd reply, feeling genuinely grateful. Visiting them became our weekend ritual. Those days were filled with backyard barbecues and lengthy chats over cups of steaming coffee. Life was good, simple and honest, until it wasn't. Harry got called away on a long business trip, a whole year out of state. It was a fantastic opportunity for his career, but the timing was brutal. No sooner had Harry left than Mr. and Mrs. Dawson's health took a nosedive. It happened fast, and Mrs. Dawson, bless her heart, sounded near out of her mind with worry when she called. "Grace, I hate to ask, but I could really use your help around here. Mr. Dawson is really not doing well," her voice thick with unshed tears. Without a second thought, I packed a bag and headed to the suburbs. Seeing Mr. and Mrs. Dawson so frail shook me. He had always been a pillar, strong and steady. Now he looked shrunken, tethered to his life through a maze of medical tubes. I slipped into the routine of their household seamlessly, handling the cooking and cleaning while Mrs. Dawson focused on Mr. Dawson's care. Evenings, I spent sitting by their side, reading aloud his favorite classics, his eyes often fluttering closed long before I finished a chapter. "Thank you, Grace," he'd whisper on good days, his voice a shadow of its former robust tone. "It's my pleasure, really," I'd say, squeezing his hand, trying to offer comfort through simple touch. One quiet afternoon, Mrs. Dawson sat down at the kitchen table while I was chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked older than her years. "Grace, I don't know how to say this, but we're in a bit of a bind," she began, nervously wringing her hands. "Mr. Dawson was the main earner, you know, and with him like this." I put down the knife, giving her my full attention. "We're strapped, honey. I hate to even ask, but could you consider renting out your apartment? It might help us get through this tough spot." She looked down, clearly embarrassed. I didn't even hesitate. "Of course, Mrs. Dawson, I'll get on it right away," I said firmly, trying to ease her burden. The apartment rented out quickly, and every month I dutifully transferred the rental income to Mrs. Dawson, along with money for groceries and whatever bills piled up. It wasn't easy. The commute to my job in the city became a nightmare, but family sticks together, right? That's what I kept telling myself, even on the hardest days. "You're a godsend, Grace," Mrs. Dawson would often say, her relief palpable each time I handed her the money. "It's what family does," I'd respond, though some nights, as I lay in the guest room listening to the distant sounds of sirens from the city, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. Harry's calls were my only respite, his voice a tether to another life. "How's it going, Kim? You holding up okay?" His concern was always evident, even through the static of long-distance calls. "We're managing, don't worry about us," I'd forced cheerfulness into my voice, not wanting to add to his stress. Life in the Dawson household took a drastic turn when Emily, Mrs. Dawson's daughter from her first marriage, showed up unexpectedly. The vibe shifted immediately. She had that kind of presence, like a cold breeze that sneaks under the door. I never really knew Emily well, but I'd heard enough from Harry and even glimpsed her frosty relationship with Mr. and Mrs. Dawson.